You check your bank balance at 11:47 at night. Not because anything happened. Not because you're worried about a specific bill. You just check it. The way you check your phone for no reason. And for half a second before the number even loads, something in your chest tightens. That tightness isn't really about the number. It's about not knowing what the number means anymore. Most people assume that feeling comes from being bad with money, careless, undisciplined. Somewhere along the way, you probably told yourself that too, quietly, almost automatically, like it was just a fact about who you are. But here's the strange part. Some of the most financially anxious people on earth aren't the ones who spend the most. They're the ones who never built a system to think about money at all. They react to it. They never designed a relationship with it. Maybe you've noticed it in smaller moments too. The way a grocery run turns into $40 extra you can't quite account for. The way a treat yourself purchase feels good for exactly the length of the checkout process, and then quietly stops meaning anything by the time it arrives. You're not lazy. You're not undisciplined. You're just navigating a system that was never designed to make financial clarity easy, and no one ever handed you a different way to think about it. And that's where this gets interesting, because there's a country where an entire generation quietly built the opposite, not through extreme frugality, not through spreadsheets and shame, but through something closer to a philosophy. In Korea, minimalist money culture has produced an unusually high number of people who feel calm about their finances, even in one of the most expensive, socially competitive economies in Asia. Not because they earn more, because they think differently. So the real question isn't, how do I save more? It's why does a completely different mental structure produce a completely different emotional outcome? And once you see it, you can't really unsee it. Let's start with the belief most people carry without ever examining it, that if they just had more willpower, this wouldn't be a problem. That's comforting in a strange way, because it puts the blame somewhere familiar. Yourself. But willpower was never really the variable. If it were, disciplined, intelligent, hardworking people wouldn't consistently overspend. And they do. Constantly. Because the modern economy wasn't built to test your willpower. It was built to bypass it entirely. One-click purchases removed the pause. Infinite scroll removed the stopping point. Targeted ads didn't sell products anymore. They sold identities, the version of you that owns the thing, whereas the thing becomes the thing. Here's where it gets uncomfortable. Most spending isn't really about need. It's about self-definition. Every unplanned purchase is a small, unconscious sentence you're writing about who you are or who you're trying to become. That candle isn't a candle. It's evidence of the calm, put-together person you wish you felt like at 9 p.m. on a Tuesday. That's not a character flaw. That's just what happens when identity and consumption get quietly wired together by an economy that profits from the confusion. Think about the last thing you bought that you didn't plan to buy. Chances are, in the moment, it wasn't really about the object. It was about a version of your life the object seemed to promise. 30 seconds of feeling ahead, feeling put together, feeling like the gap between where you are and where you want to be had closed, just slightly. That feeling is real. It's just borrowed, and it's due back almost immediately. And this is exactly what Korean minimalist money culture was built to interrupt. Not spending less. Spending slower. There's a practice, sometimes tied to the tradition of the Tongjang, a physical bank book, where every transaction is written and seen, not just swiped and forgotten. There's a habit of waiting 24 hours before non-essential purchases, not as punishment, but as a pause long enough for the impulse to reveal whether it was really about the item or about something else entirely: boredom, stress, comparison. And there's a simple one-in, one-out principle that quietly protects against the slow accumulation of things that were never really wanted, just acquired. At first, this looks like discipline. But this is where things get strange, because discipline was never really the mechanism. Friction was. These practices don't rely on you being strong enough to resist. They just make the frictionless world of modern spending slightly less frictionless. And it turns out that's often all it takes. But intention alone collapses without structure behind it. This is where the second layer comes in, the part most people never realize matters more than the spending habits themselves. Paying yourself first. Before rent, before bills, before anything else, a fixed percentage moves somewhere untouched. Not because it's extra, because it's treated as non-negotiable, the way rent is non-negotiable. Multiple accounts, each with a specific purpose, not to complicate things, but to remove the exhausting mental math of, can I afford this right now? Because the money already has a job before you even see it. There's something quietly emotional about this that gets missed. In Korean saving culture, saving isn't framed as deprivation. It's framed as self-respect. A version of care you're giving your future self, the same way you'd care for someone you love. That reframing changes everything about how saving feels. It stops being restriction and starts being devotion. Compare that to the way most people talk about saving in the West, as sacrifice, as the thing you do reluctantly so you can eventually afford to enjoy your life. No wonder it feels heavy. No wonder it gets abandoned the moment stress shows up. A system built on guilt rarely survives contact with a hard month. A system built on care usually does, because it isn't fighting against how you feel. It's working with it. But structure protects money. It doesn't protect the mind underneath the structure. And this is the part that surprises people most. There's a quieter thread running through this entire philosophy, one that has almost nothing to do with money directly. Decluttering physical space. Practicing conscious gratitude for what already exists, rather than constantly scanning for what's missing. At first, this seems like a completely separate idea, until you notice what it's actually doing. Clutter, physical and digital, keeps the nervous system in a low-grade state of comparison and unfinished business. And comparison is the emotional fuel behind almost all identity spending. Remove the noise, and the craving to constantly add more often fades on its own. Not because you're trying harder, because there's less internal chaos asking to be soothed by a purchase. The goal was never to have less. It was to see clearly enough to know what you actually value, instead of guessing based on what everyone else seems to want. But here's the honest part, the part most people leave out. This philosophy works, but only if it's chosen, not forced. There's a version of minimalist money culture that curdles into something else entirely. Quiet guilt every time money is spent, anxiety dressed up as discipline, restriction that has nothing to do with intention, and everything to do with fear. The moment saving stops being a form of self-respect and starts being a way to avoid feeling irresponsible, it isn't minimalism anymore. It's just a more sophisticated kind of anxiety. That distinction matters more than any individual rule, because the point was never to spend the least amount of money possible. It was to spend in a way that actually reflects what you care about, so the small tightness in your chest at 11:47 p.m. has less and less reason to show up. If any of these rules ever start to feel like punishment instead of care, that's not a sign to push harder. That's the signal to step back and ask what they were actually protecting in the first place. Financial stability was never really about the number on the screen. It's the quiet absence of that specific kind of dread, the feeling of not knowing where your money went, or who you were when you spent it. It's built slowly, in small intentional decisions, not in one dramatic overhaul. You don't need 8 rules memorized perfectly. You need one shift, the willingness to pause long enough to ask whether a purchase reflects who you are or who you're afraid of not being. If this helped you see money a little differently, you can subscribe. There's more of this kind of thinking ahead.